Today's speaker is, of course, Dr. Bruce Wheeler in the corner over there. Bruce grew up in Dine, North Carolina. He received his Bachelor's of Arts at Duke University, his Master of Arts at the University of North Carolina, and his PhD at the University of Virginia. Before arriving to the University of Tennessee in 1970, Bruce had also taught in Virginia, Ohio, and Illinois. Bruce is the author or co-author of several books, the most recent being Knoxville, Tennessee, Mountain City in the New South in 2005, and Discovering the American Past, 7th edition, correct? 2011. Bruce lives with his wife Linda in Wears Valley. He spends his time writing, singing shake note music, and also flower gardening. Please help me welcome Dr. Bruce Wheeler.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm always nervous when the listeners get a chance to rate the speaker. I've never gotten used to that, and I was required when I was teaching. I was required to have that done every class, every semester, and I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now. But well, I mean, one of these students wrote out on the evaluation, and this was in a History of the South course. He said, well, he's a pretty good teacher, but he talks too much about the past. What's that all about? As you know, I have retired. I retired in 2005, and then came back a little bit, and then finally have retired. And people ask me, well, why did you do that? And for some of you who are retired, it seems like a silly question, but I'll give you one story which will summarize this. This was in my last year. This was what tipped me over the edge. It was the last class. It was an 8 o'clock class, and oh, I know, I'm being taped, so I'm not supposed to move too much. It was the last class, and their papers were due. And so at 8 o'clock, I came in, and they were there, and I closed the door, and I said, all right, pass in your papers, and I stacked them on the desk, and I said, now every paper that comes in after this is going to be late and is going to be penalized. And the students liked that. I mean, their papers were on time, and so they liked the idea. And so I began my lecture, and the door opened. And a student came in on crutches. Now, what are you going to do about that? And as you know, students, and if you are students, you are like that, they're like wolves. They hang together in packs. And so they wanted to know, what was I going to do? So finally I said, all right. He tried to get here on time, but he couldn't because of his temporary disability. So, sir, if you'll put your paper on this stack, it will not be late and will not be penalized. And I smiled, the students smiled, and the class smiled. And I closed the door and started again. And about 3 minutes later, the door opened. And this young woman came in, and somebody in the back of the class said, limp. See what I'm talking about here? I want to talk to you in an irreverent way about a portion of the Higher Ground exhibit, which I just think is wonderful. And I'm going to be as brief as I can, because I want us, if you haven't seen this little portion of these 5 artists, I want us to get a chance to go up there, and Kirsten and Steve are going to talk about that and answer questions. But I want to talk about the environment in which these people worked. And I want to start out by talking about a native Knoxvillian who in April 22nd, 1925, this native Knoxvillian, University of Tennessee alumnus, class of 1915, and nationally known writer and critic, wrote an essay on censorship, which appeared in The Nation magazine. It was one of several essays he had written about that subject for Nation. And in this piece, Joseph Wood Crouch announced that he had found the perfect censor. And censorship in the mid-20s was a big issue, as it is now. The perfect censor. The perfect censor, he said, was Knoxville socialite and founder of the Bonnie Kate chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, Mary Boyce Temple. Now, I've checked to find out that there are no living direct relatives of this woman before I have said this. In Mary Utopia Rothrock's history of Knox County, the French Broad Holston country, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Ms. Temple's biography noted that many interesting legends cluster around Miss Temple and her social reign for 4 decades of Knoxville history. She was the pinnacle of Knoxville society. But for Crouch, the fact that she was the perfect censor came because she attacked the impending opening in Knoxville of Somerset Maugham's play Rain. I think it later was made into a movie called Sadie Thompson with Rita Hayworth. But Rain, even though she admitted to the Knoxville News that she had neither seen nor read the play, but she was against it for reasons that she did not go into. Well, for Crouch, this tidbit told him volumes about the city in which he was born, and the university from which he was graduated, and the failure of free expression to thrive in Tennessee's 3rd largest city. The question that I would propose to answer is, why did the South's 3rd largest and most important commercial center fail to nurture the visual, the print, and the performing arts? Is it because the town was too small? That's always a good answer. But no. Between 1920 and 1930, the population of Knoxville had increased 36%. It was a growing, in fact, mushrooming city. Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Has anybody ever been there? As we in East Tennessee said, where that's at. It's down on the Gulf. You've been to Ocean Spring, Mississippi? A town of 17,000 people, a bustling and alive arts community. I had the pleasure of visiting Helena, Montana not too long ago, and their arts community is thriving in a town of 29,000 people. So it's not size. Is it perhaps the fact that the population has to be aging or young, or is there something about the age? Well, again, no. 83% of Knoxville's population was 45 years old and younger. Was a young, one would think, dynamic, innovative group. Lack of wealthy elite, you need patrons. Again, no. Sanford, Tyson, Chamberlain, Albers, plenty of disposable income to support the arts. And a lot of this, as you know, came from outside. It came from outside the South. I was at the Cherokee Country Club not long ago, and I did something I should never have done. It was right after lunch. I can't stop myself if I've eaten. And I said, if you look back far enough in your genealogy, which you may need to get into this club, you will find something worse than an illegitimate child or a horse thief. You're going to find a Yankee. Well, two women had to leave the room. They were visibly upset, and I guess for good cause. And one of them said, he's talking about Granddad. And I was. But these people had the income to support, to be patrons of the arts. The key, I think, was the question of the acceptance and toleration of change, of diversity, of new trends and new ideas. The 1920s, as you know, is a dynamic period in American history. If I wasn't teaching early American, which is my favorite, the Washington, Jefferson, and the other heroes, I would have liked to have taught the 1920s. Urbanization, the great migration of African Americans out of the South and into the urban North, the Harlem Renaissance, the reactions to all of these changes in terms of prohibition, the Immigration Act, government corruption, which included, by the way, Knoxville. Knoxville's situation was so corrupt, it had a commission form of government that it finally was done away with, and a city manager form was replaced. That form of government was killed by Cas Walker some years later, a man who killed a lot of ideas. A man who opposed daylight savings time because it killed all the grass for the cattle is I can't wait for you. You got to believe me. One of the things that irritates me is sometimes when students will raise their hand and say, is that really true? I mean, what am I doing here? And look at the writers who are burgeoning forth. Sherwood Anderson, William Faulkner, Eugene O'Neill, John Dos Passos, T.S. Eliot, and music. This is the era, in my opinion, of music. Rodgers and Hart, George and Ira Gershwin, Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, Cole Porter. My favorite is Cole Porter. Just for the first act of Anything Goes is good enough. The New York Armory Show in 1913 with Picasso and Matisse, Duchamp. One critic said of Duchamp it looked like an explosion in a shingle factory. But Knoxville seemed unable to participate. It had the population, it had the finances, it had good demography, and it had nice diversity. But it was a fragmented community, a community divided by race. Fairly placid in terms of race relations, but in 1919, a very, very difficult race riot. In the 1920s, the largest per capita Ku Klux Klan chapter of any town in the country, here in Knoxville. We have the membership records down at the McClung Historical Center. If you'd like to check on some of your neighbors, your relatives, be my guest. I said that to a group of students years ago, and one of my students went down there and she said, "Oh no, there is my great uncle. And he's a liar." Like being a Klansman was okay, but not telling the truth wasn't. I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" She said, well, he's got here his application, in his application form, his occupation is preacher. Preachers paid half dues. She said, "My great uncle hadn't been in a church in a century, half a century." It was fragmented by class. As whites began to move out of the city and at first into West Knoxville, a separate town, we now call it Fort Sanders, annexed in the 1890s, then to Looney's Bend, Sequoia, and to Tullahi. And between 1920 and 1930, the white population of Knoxville actually decreased in actual numbers. Prohibition. Each city in 1907, each city in the state had the right to vote whether it would be dry or not. Knoxville was the only city to vote to go into prohibition. Partly, according to Roger Posey, a person who's written on this, it was a racial issue to keep alcohol and clubs away from African Americans. And so one can say that a legal alcoholic beverage was not mixed or drunk in public until the early 1970s, where the first one was consumed by Mayor Kyle Testerman. I know you're shocked to hear this. What you ought to be shocked is that it was a gin and tonic. Censorship, evolution is going on just down the road, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The lack of toleration by the people who were the community's leaders. They traveled, they read, but somehow were never touched by their experiences. Were they open to other thoughts, other lifestyles? Probably not. Joseph Wood Crouch thought not. In his autobiography, written years later, he said of Knoxville, adults and children alike were unadventurous, both physically and intellectually. Their world was thoroughly provincial. Now, I had the pleasure of my first full-time teaching job was at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. The town had a population of 7,000, and the number of students in the school were 14,000. And the students had a remarkable effect on that town. One of the things that the city fathers simply were going to have to stop. First of all, they were afraid that the students would start registering to vote in Athens rather than where they were from, like Cleveland and Toledo and other places I don't even want to talk about. And so they asked, when people registered to vote, they asked one simple question: where do you spend December 25th? And it was never in Athens. And yet, that student body and that faculty and that staff and administration changed that city. Now, maybe calling themselves the Harvard on the Hocking, which they did, was maybe a little bit too much. But it was something that was alive. That its heart was beating. A major state university in a town should be the significant, powerful force to bring forth new ideas, diversity, change, and tolerance. But it wasn't. Not here. In 1915, I told you Crouch wrote a lot of essays on censorship. This is one of the reasons why. In 1915, when he was a senior, he wrote an article in the student magazine critical of the state legislature and their policy on alcohol prohibition. UT President Brown Ayers was desperately seeking state appropriations, and so the dean of the faculty or the college, later the UT President Hoskins, named a library after him, called Crouch into his office and said, remember your First Amendment, one more article like that and you're out of here. Crouch said, well, I was lucky it was the last issue for the year and I was going to graduate in a while. And then he said something in his autobiography which I liked. He said, I had established myself as what my literary hero, which was George Bernard Shaw, would have called the devil's disciple, which I was. In a class there. Now, I can be sometimes a little bit gnarly to students, but here's one, an English professor. Crouch was an English major. He said to the class, when I ask you a question, I want you to tell me exactly what I have told you. I'm not interested in your opinions because I do not think they are of any value whatsoever. How are we going to build One woman stopped that same faculty member on the street and asked if he knew the author of a poem that she had just read, and she recited a few verses, and he said, "I am glad to say I cannot. They are very bad." And that was that. And that didn't dissipate. Not long after I got here, I stopped a professor, a colleague of mine, as he was getting on the elevator and he was getting ready to go to class. I knew he was getting ready to go to class. He had his notes and he had his map. So I asked the obvious question, "Where are you going?" PhDs can ask dumb questions too. And he said, and I quote, "I am going to cast artificial pearls before real swine." Now that is not the way we are going to start fibrillations in the student body. In 1923, then President Harcourt Morgan, aided by Dean Hoskins and all the other deans, dismissed 13 faculty members. The rest of the faculty were drawn into what Crouch called the circle of fear. He said the president was afraid of the legislature, the faculty were afraid of the president. And Morgan called all the deans in and he said, "Now I'm going to fire these people. And now, do you have anybody else that you would like me to fire while I'm at it?" And all the hands went up. John R. Neal, the famous attorney who later founded a law school in downtown Knoxville, was one of those who was fired. The only person that probably ought to have been dismissed was, I'm sorry to say this, was Ms. Ada Withers, a assistant professor of art. She was hired in 1921. Dean Hoskins believed that she was there to teach what he called applied arts, which in the 20s meant home economics. But she believed that she was there to teach fine arts. And so after 2 years, she was dismissed. Philip Hamer, a professor, he had left before I got here, but in his story, he said she had a vitriolic and uncontrollable tongue. Reminds one of another person who was there not long after, Ruth Stevens, who could do that. Ruth Stevens, a chain smoker, was standing outside of Ayers Hall one time getting a smoke in between classes, and one of her students came up and said, "Dr. Stevens, I would rather have sex with a stranger than smoke a cigarette." And Stevens said, "So would I, honey, but I only got 10 minutes." Is that true? Yeah, that's true. The AAUP came to investigate the university, and while they gave us a black eye, they did say of Withers, she was a rather difficult person to get along with and was nervous and emotional. Her husband taught Spanish, and he lasted for 7 more years, but he wrote a letter to the editor critical of the president, and then he was fired as well. I'm trying to trace what happened to them after 1930. There is a photograph of her in the University of West Florida archives. Now, how it got there, I'm still interested to know. At the same time, the Butler Act, the law that Scopes might or might not have violated, the president. Now, this is interesting. President Morgan quietly issued unofficial instructions to his teaching staff that they should make no changes in their instruction. In other words, go ahead and teach evolution, just don't say anything about it. But when the president of Vanderbilt, and by the way, Morgan came from the agriculture campus, and he did teach courses that talked about evolution. But when the president of Vanderbilt came and begged Morgan to come with a united front of all the university presidents to Nashville to lobby, and Morgan was not there. The president was afraid of the legislature, faculty afraid of the president. Morgan's letter, this is one of my favorites. I have a student working on this project. In 1927, there was rumors published in a Methodist magazine. By the way, I should tell you, for fear of being misinterpreted, I do not belong to a organized religious denomination. I am a Methodist. Well, is there anybody here who would disagree with that? But there was a rumor in this Methodist magazine that some students at UT had formed an atheists club. And there were letters from people throughout the state. And Morgan and Dean Massey, see, we named buildings after these people, wrote back. Here's my, this is Morgan's letter to one of those people. I have not, during my 25 years connection with this university, seen the student body so serious or spiritually minded. We get an odd duck occasionally, whose parents nor anybody else could have control of his religious attitude. But the ministers of this town tell me that the university's atmosphere is the best that they have seen, including their own church schools. There's absolutely nothing in the report. Well, whether there was or was not, who cares? James Agee. We know about Agee, and we think of him as a later being. But Agee actually went to high school here. And later he wrote about Knoxville High School. He called it Knoxton High, ill-disguised. And this is what he had to say. There was a library, a branch of the Lawson McGee Library, likewise a memorial, and the librarian could show you promptly the 12 copies of Silas Marner, the history of the World War, Vanity Fair, Elsie Werner, Halleck's English Literature, and a 1906 bound volume of Life magazine. But at mention of Sinclair Lewis, she looked shocked. And is recorded that when asked to excavate a copy of Ethan Frome, the woman asked what he had written, and then hunted in vain. I guess Edith Wharton hadn't gotten quite this far. This was the environment in which our 5 artists were born. 4 of the 5 were born here, and 1 of them grew up here. An environment intolerant of different ideas, of different lifestyles, of any kind of diversity at all. Afraid of novelty, afraid of change, fragmented by race, fragmented by class, suspicious of new artistic trends, and with no university that would stand there and say, this is wrong. And so we're going to look at them. Buford and Joseph Delaney, born in Knoxville, and you're familiar with, they're probably the best known of the artists that we're going to see. And by the way, interestingly, all of these, every single one of these 5 people that we're going to look at wound up in New York. Now, Buford then went to Paris, and Hearst went to London, and Farr went to San Francisco. But they all spent considerable time in New York. It was the place where you went where you were going to be, I guess to use the term, avant-garde. But you look at the self-portrait of Delaney, and you can see that something new is happening. Look at the New York Marble Collegiate Church of Joseph Delaney. A huge canvas, very, very impressive. 2 of these artists practiced what's called magic realism, and we'll hear more about that later on. Charles Griffin Farr grew up in Knoxville. He wound up in San Francisco. You could look at Street in Knoxville, and then I think one of the most disturbing paintings in our collection here is one called The Cocktail Hour. And you look at it and you tell me what you feel from this. Charles Raine, born in Knoxville, eventually to New York. He has, in my opinion, and I warned Kirsten, I said, if you leave the door open at night in this museum, and Rain's painting The Heron is gone, you will know where it has gone. It's magnificent. It's realistic, but not quite. And then finally, Edward Harrison Hearst Jr., who's really the only one that had family in Knoxville. He came back considerably. We have one portrait, a charcoal and chalk portrait, which we should have more because he was best known for those. We have two other pieces. 5 men attempting to express themselves in new themes in art. For all of them, Knoxville was an inhospitable place, too narrow, less embracing of artistic movements, less tolerant of diverse and different lifestyles. Changing fortunes, changing scenes. They might have agreed if they had read Jacques-Louis David, the Napoleon painter, the painter of the Napoleonaires. He wrote of the artists of the Ancien Regime who came before him. He said their art was prostitution, fatally corrupted. That they had been cowed by the Ancien Regime. Nothing that ever happened to artists like that. Said David, he was no longer a lackey, a valet, or a prostitute. That would be him. Now Knoxville's not like that now. Knoxville's not like that at all. If you look here, just not only you all, but the structure and the people who come through there, and the Gerbers who have come through earlier. Interesting people. They'll be back. What changed? When did it change? How did it change? And why? In 1904, a local Knoxville publisher by the name of Russell Harrison said that Knoxville, Tennessee would grow in importance in spite of itself. And that may have been, that may be the most important thing that he ever, and the truest thing that he ever wrote. So let's look at the work of these 5 people. But let me tell you, I didn't really tell you the whole truth about why I retired. I was teaching in the summer. The constant need for tuition for my daughter at the time. So I was teaching in the summer, and I was teaching Western civilization. That's the course that you all have learned to love and embrace, and I was giving a test on the medieval church, and one of the students wanted to say that the medieval clergy was expected to remain celibate, and she knew that celibate meant without sex. But, listen, she couldn't spell celibate. Now, by the way, I have a copy of this in my office, if you don't believe this, because this is what she wrote. And I quote. She said, the medieval clergy was expected to remain celibate. And she did misspell it. But afterwards, in parentheses, she wrote, I can't spell without sex. And I thought, now is the time. Let's go upstairs. Thank you very much. Thank you.